The term hidden gem is often thrown around these days in many reviews you'll have watched, and one may argue that these days there really aren't any hidden gems as the community has pretty much all of them covered. But there is an N64 game which is often overlooked and has never quite achieved the acclaim that some people may argue that it deserves. As usual, when doing my research for this game, I also checked out Dome Candy Game's review of it. Well, after all, it's one of my favourite YouTube channels and I was glad to see that he too shares the same opinions that I do. Winback, or Operation Winback as it's known here in the PAL region, is a 1999 release by Koei which was developed by its studio Omega Force. The game was actually due out a whole year earlier, however at the last minute the game was put back into development so that the studio could iron out the camera issues that plagued early builds of the game. Prior to the game's release, it was seen by many to be the N64's answer to Metal Gear Solid. This was not what the developers were going for, however. Whereas Metal Gear Solid relied on stealth, Winback was to be an all-out third-person action shooter. But to say that the game didn't take influences from Metal Gear Solid would be naive. The core gameplay mechanic of Winback is the cover mechanic, and like Metal Gear Solid, you can stick your character to various surfaces to take cover. Whereas Metal Gear Solid often used this to aid you in the stealth throughout the game, Winback did things a little differently. The cover mechanic here was used for combat, and if you've played games like Gears of War, you'll feel right at home here, but it may interest you to know that this is where this concept all came from. The game also featured a laser sight to your guns, which again would be picked up by future games, and now is about as commonplace as having guns in games in the first place. The storyline is kept simple and straightforward, but it's not to say it isn't an interesting one. A terrorist group calling themselves Crying Lions has taken control of a space laser weapon. This weapon can pinpoint and obliterate any target after 4 hours of charging, and is controlled at the Gulf Complex, which have been taken over by the terrorists and their leader Kenneth Coleman. With the world in the hands of the terrorists, the Special Covert Action Team, or SCAT for short, is called in to reclaim this base, and after an introductory helicopter sequence that's pulled straight from Predator, you'll learn more about the other members of your team briefly before you're forced to make an emergency evacuation which divides your team all across the base. As the player, you take control of Jean-Luc Cougar, and you must enter the complex, regroup with your team, and destroy the control command before the terrorists can use the satellite again. To keep things interesting, the developers put 2 different endings into the game, one good one and one bad one, and this depends on how quickly you can complete the game, which certainly adds some replayability to the experience. Now as always, I'll be honest and I'll say that I wasn't instantly impressed by Winback. The controls for one do take some getting used to, especially as there are a lot of different and unique manoeuvres that you can pull off. The game does feature a fairly detailed training mode which should give you the basics you'll need to hit the game, but you can expect to get killed, and killed often when you first start playing as you get used to the somewhat primitive cover system. But you've got to stick with it. Give yourself a chance to run up to walls, take cover, peek around corners and take down each enemy one shot at a time. This is not a game like 0 Hour where you can just run around all guns blazing. If you do, then you'll find that you're often back at the last checkpoint having to rethink your plan of attack. To aid you in this, you do have a number of different weapons, your basic pistol, a machine gun and a shotgun for close combat, as well as a number of sneak attacks like knockouts and hand-to-hand combat. Fans of huge arsenals may be sad to hear there's not a wider range of weapons here, but they do the purpose and do add a sense of realism to the game. There's also a few different special weapons, so you can get them from time to time, and these include things like C4 explosives to blast your way into new areas, a rocket launcher, and silenced weapons for when you need to keep yourself as quiet as possible. Earlier on I talked about how the game was put back into development to fix the camera issues, and for the best part this seems to have worked. The camera has an intuitive mode where it will try to position itself where it believes you need to see. This doesn't always work out quite so well, so when you do get used to the game's controls, I would suggest turning the camera to manual mode and you'll have a far better range of movement and controls of the camera itself. One of the highlights of this game though isn't its size. There are over 30 levels and there are numerous boss battles, some of which are epic and you'll really need to dig deep to get past them, as well as using your brain to figure out how you can trade shots with them without getting taken down. With each of the levels having multiple checkpoints, you'll always feel that you're progressing, and of course the quicker you complete the game the better the ending you'll get. The game's multiplayer mode is a total miss, it just really doesn't work, and the stealth is instead replaced by random running and gunning, so this isn't the next GoldenEye. Visually, Winback is not the strongest game on the console, but it's not a bad looking game either. There's no expansion pack support, but you'll be pleased to know that the frame rate never really seems to drop a beat, even when there are multiple enemies peppering you with shots from a distance. The entire game does have that funny softness that you'll be used to from years of N64 gaming, but this is forgiven however considering just how good the character animations are. Sure, some of them do look a little stiff, but the sheer number and range of moves and character models is impressive. The audio too is nicely done, and far better than you may have been expecting. Now there's no voice acting in the cutscenes, but the music does have a very strong Metal Gear Solid feel to it. It also picks up the pace when you're under attack or taking serious damage, and whilst it's not as seamless in the games like Rare produced, it does help you to realise when you need to act quickly and when you have time to explore your surroundings without the risk. All of this hard work in the sound department is undone however with some awfully cheesy sounding music at certain points in the game that does change the entire feel from being intense and urgent to downright silly. The effects do mark this and they are brilliant. Personally, the shotgun sounds are the best I've heard on the N64, and the real thump that you'll hear when unloading a shot is very satisfying. The real dilemma though is which version to play. The game was later ported to the PlayStation 2 as an enhanced version with added voice acting, a more refined control system and better camera control movement. Not to mention this, but the bumped up graphics which do make that superior version in many ways. The game also sold well enough to have a sequel, but sadly this never made it onto the N64, which was finished by this time. The real beauty of the game though is that there's nothing quite like it on the N64. It has a third person shooter action of 0 hour, no ability to move and shoot like the controls of Resident Evil and the AI of GoldenEye. The storyline is straightforward with twists along the way as you meet your team members, and there is some stealth thrown in with traps which you'll need to disarm. Funnily enough though, I'd probably say it's most similar to Mission Impossible. Both games are not the best looking, but have good storylines, are fun to play, and while flawed, they are both unique games which I think you should play through at least once. And so for today's topic of conversation, I want to know if you've played this title. It's a game which rarely comes up in conversation, but it does have its following in the community. Do you think they tried too hard to make a Metal Gear Solid clone, but didn't put enough into the stealth? Or do you think that the more intense action helped this game to forge its own identity? Whatever your thoughts, let me know in the comment section down below, and until next time.